How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Wednesday, middle of the week. Shabbos coming closer, thank God. Let's light up the darkness. New wisdom candle. Get that wick ready. Who's in the house on a Wednesday? Stephen in New Hampshire, Bill in Missouri, Carla in Brazil, Paula in the Great Northwest, Ryan in Florida, Sharon in New Jersey, Bella in Florida, John in Maine, Jonathan north of LA, Melissa in Great Neck, Joe in the Inland Empire, Ella says shalom, Aoife in Florida, Marjorie in Virginia, Marie in Freeport. Welcome everybody. Another double daf. We're getting caught up. Not too far behind now. Thank God. Our daf is Yud Aleph, page 11 here, pages 11 and 12 here in Tractate Bava Kamma, the 21st volume of the Talmud. We're continuing our discussion of Mishnah number 2 here in this tractate, mostly about damages. What happens when something that's incumbent upon you to safeguard it and make sure it doesn't harm others, like your ox, your pit, your fire, or you yourself, does in fact injure another person, causing damages. These 4 cases all have slightly different outcomes. That's why they're specified. But what they do have in common is that if you have to pay, you don't have money or movable property with which to pay, and you do have real property, land, you're going to have to give of your superior quality land to make the injured party whole. Okay, so now we're speaking about these kinds of cases where you damage, but also related cases where, let's say, my ox gores my neighbor's ox, or there's other cases where his ox comes to be damaged or killed, and I'm responsible, like, for example, if he left it in my care, either as a favor to him, or he paid me, or I borrowed the ox, or I rented it, and it died while it was in my care due to my negligence, or perhaps I stole the ox from him and it died while it was in my care. So in all these cases, there's going to have, sort of different liability, different requirements for me making him whole, or in the case of a thief, more than whole. I'm going to have to replace the ox, the value of the ox, and times 2. But what about the dead ox? What about the dead ox, right? Do I, as the one who injured his ox, do I get credit for that? Like, he had a living ox, now he's got a dead ox. Do I have to replace his living ox? If so, do I get the carcass of the dead ox? Or does the injured party keep the carcass of the dead ox? After all, he didn't do anything. Suddenly his ox is dead. Or perhaps, okay, well, now he's got a carcass that actually has quite a bit of value. I mean, a dead cow is worth a lot of money. So is my responsibility to make him whole, to give him the value of the living ox that he had before, and he has the dead ox? Or do I just have to, in order to make him whole, do I just owe him the value of the difference between the living ox that he had and the dead carcass that he's got now? These are the kinds of questions we are addressing. We pick it up at the very bottom of page 10b. The Gemara asks, shall we say that the issue of the diminishing value of the carcass, right? Now that I've killed his ox, or my ox killed his ox, he's got a dead ox. Now, for there to be actual, for me to be liable for damages, he's going to have to take me to court. I mean, if I fight it, he's going to have to take me to court and get a judgment. Now, that can certainly take some time. And meanwhile, that carcass is rotting. It's diminishing in value quickly. So at what point is that dead ox going to get appraised so that we can say, okay, well, if the dead ox is part of the equation, how much exactly is it worth? So the Gemara asks, shall we say that the issue of the diminishing value of the carcass is a dispute between the Tanaim, the sages of the Mishnah? Meaning the sages of the Gemara, a later period, are saying, well, I mean, the sages from the earlier generation, they hadn't resolved this question. They also had a dispute about this. As it is taught in a Baraisa, the verse states with regard to a case where an animal was entrusted with a paid bailee, right? So you paid someone to watch your cow for you. I was, just coming home, listening on the radio, and they were talking about, like a doggy hotel, right? People go away, they put their dog in a doggy hotel. They're paying the doggy hotel to take care of their dog. If something happens to their dog while it's in the doggy hotel, the owners of the doggy hotel are going to have some responsibility, right? So that's a paid bailee. So the verse states, with regard to a case where an animal was entrusted with a paid bailee and was attacked by a wild beast. So Exodus 22:12, if it be torn in pieces, let him bring a witness. Who's going to bring a witness? The owner or the bailee? So this means, and now we're on 11a, this means the bailee should bring a witness, right? The one who was paid to watch the animal. The bailee should bring witnesses that the animal was mauled through circumstances beyond his control. Could have happened to anybody. You can't blame me just because I was the paid bailee. And based on their testimony, he would be exempt from liability. Abba Shaul says the word aid, witness, should not be interpreted in this situation as witness in this context. Aid doesn't mean witness, but rather the carcass. Accordingly, the bailee should immediately bring the carcass, known as aduda, right? The Hebrew for that is aduda. He should bring it to court in order to appraise its current value, not later when it's rotting. So what? Is it not so that they disagree about this matter? That one sage, Abba Shaul, holds that the loss due to the diminishing value of the carcass is sustained by the injured party, so there is a need to appraise its value immediately in order to correctly assess how much the one liable for the damage must pay. And the other sage, the first Tan of this Baraisa, holds that the loss due to the diminishing value of the carcass is sustained by the one liable for the damage because the Torah granted him ownership of it. In other words, the paid bailee is going to have to replace the value of the living animal that the owner had when he entrusted his animal to the bailee, and the bailee will keep the carcass. And the Gemara rejects this understanding of the Baraisa. No, actually everyone agrees that the loss due to the diminishing value of the carcass is sustained by the injured party, since he owns it. And here they disagree concerning who must go to the effort of retrieving the carcass and transporting it to the court where it can be appraised. And so it is taught in a Baraisa. Others say, from where is it derived that it is incumbent upon the owner of the pit to raise the ox from his pit after it fell in and died? The verse states, the owner of the pit shall pay. He shall restore money to its owner, and the carcass shall be his. That's Exodus 21:34, right? You dug a pit, you created a hazard. Somebody's ox came along, fell in the pit, and died. Obviously, you owe the owner of the ox the value of the ox. Who keeps the carcass? Apparently, the owner of the pit, the one who caused the damage. So they read the term and the carcass as a second subject of the term he shall restore. So it therefore indicates that the one liable for the damage must restore the carcass to the injured party by retrieving it from the pit. He doesn't keep it. It's his responsibility to get it out of the pit. The fact that this opinion is introduced with the phrase, others say, suggests that it stands in opposition to another opinion, That other opinion apparently holds that the owner of the injured animal is responsible, that the owner of the injured animal is responsible for retrieving the carcass out of the pit. So Abaye said to Rava, what are the circumstances in which the one who is liable for the damage, right, the one who dug the pit, that he is the one required to go to this effort to retrieve the carcass from the pit? If we say that while still inside the pit, the carcass is worth a dinar, and when it is at the edge of the pit, since it is more accessible, then its market value increases and is worth 4 dinars. Then, when the one liable for the damage expends the effort to retrieve the carcass, he is expending the effort for his own sake, since by increasing the value of the carcass, he reduces his own liability. Therefore, he will certainly retrieve it of his own accord, and it is not necessary for the Torah to require him to do so. So Rava said to him, actually, no. It is necessary to require him to retrieve the carcass in a case where, while still inside the pit, the carcass is worth 1 dinar, and when it is at the edge of the pit, despite being more accessible, it is still worth 1 dinar. Since it is of no benefit to him to retrieve it, right, to pull it out of the pit, the Torah has to require him to do so. And the Gemara asks, but is there ever a case like this where despite being more accessible, its market value does not change? And the Gemara answers, yes. As people say, a beam of wood in the city sells for a dinar and a beam of wood in the field also sells for a dinar, despite the fact that it needs to be transported from there to the city. Now we're going to skip a few paragraphs which describe the following case. I'm just going to read you where the halacha ended up, where the law ended up. In the case of one who stole an item, whether he is a thief or a robber, if the item then broke or depreciated in value, he must restore to the injured party an equivalent item or pay. Wow. Sorry. I need a little more light to read this fine print. Or pay the injured party the value of the item that he stole, after which the thief or robber may keep the item. This is based on the principle that one does not appraise a stolen item's value for the sake of a thief or a robber. A thief is required to pay his victim twice the value of the item that he stole. This payment combines the restitution for the value of the item that he stole and a fine, right, imposed by the Torah that is equal to the value of the item. And the Ravad rules that this double payment is calculated as follows. The restitution for the value of the item is calculated to be the value of the item before it was stolen, and not just the difference between its prior value and its current value. You know, very often somebody steals a car and then they trash it, and then the owner of the car gets it back. Well, the car is not worth what it was worth before it was stolen and trashed. By contrast, in calculating the size of the fine, one does appraise a stolen item's value. The fine is set as the difference between the item's prior value and its current value. The Rambam disagrees and holds that even when calculating the fine, one does not appraise a stolen item's value. Rather, the thief pays twice the prior value of the item. The Ramah adds that if the thief does not have money with which to pay, he may pay using even the broken shards themselves, as he could pay the victim with any other type of movable property in his possession. The Rambam writes that if the injured party is willing, he may take possession of the shards, and then the thief need pay only the difference between the item's prior value and the value of the shards, right? In other words, the trashed item after the thief got through with it. So that's where that discussion ended up. Then we're going to skip a digression, because once Ulla enters the discussion here in the Gemara, we go on a few digressions of just holdings, rulings that Ulla made that have nothing to do with the law of damages. Right? One is about when a woman gives birth. If she gives birth to a boy, she's considered ritually impure for a certain number of days. If she gives birth to a girl, it's a different number of days. What if she miscarries? There's an afterbirth. You're not sure. You can't see the fetus. it was very small, and you don't know what gender it was, then what do you do? Ulla teaches about that. Then there's a couple of other digressions. Again, halachas, laws that are brought by Ulla. I'll just quickly read you where the laws ended up. The halacha ended up on that. A father is not required to redeem his male firstborn child if it died or was mortally wounded within 30 days of its birth, right? Otherwise, if there's a bechor, right, the oldest, if the first child of a woman born to a woman is a male, so then the father has to do the redemption of the firstborn, pay a few silver coins to a Cohen. But if the child doesn't survive, then he doesn't pay. This and that through pulling. All animals, both large and small, can be acquired by the buyer, pulling them, and they do not need to be lifted up. And we've seen that law before. And the Ramah writes that some hold that a large animal can also be acquired by the transfer of its reins from the seller to the buyer. We're talking about a kinyan, an act of formal acquisition. It's not when you just pay the money. The item is not deemed to have legally passed from the seller to the owner until to the new owner, to the buyer, until the buyer does this formal act of acquisition, like pulling the animal. Some say just receiving the reins of the animal. Until that happens, it's still in the domain of the seller, who bears responsibility if something happens to that item. Then Ulla also ruled that when brothers divide an estate, when brothers divide the estate that they inherited, the court appraises the clothes that they are wearing if they came from the estate of the deceased, their father, and that sum is considered part of the portion they receive. The court does not appraise the weekday clothes of the children of the brothers, although it does appraise the value of their Shabbos clothes. Those were all rulings of Ulla. So we pick this up with yet another law cited by Ulla, taught by Ulla, who teaches it in the name of Rabbi Elazar. And Ulla says that Rabbi Elazar, and we're near the bottom of page 11b now, and Ulla says that Rabbi Elazar says, in the case of a bailee who conveyed a deposit that was entrusted to him to another bailee, right? So imagine I leave my dog at the doggy hotel, and the person running the doggy hotel says, you know what? I want to go see the football game. I can't take care of all these dogs. And there's another doggy hotel next door. Here in LA, there's actually an area where there's like 4 doggy hotels all on the same block. So the owner of one says to the owner of another, hey, could you take care of these dogs for me? I need a vacation. Yeah? So I entrusted, Dogtopia to take care of my dog. And Dogtopia put my dog over at, the Doggy Hilton. Okay, so when I come back and I find out that something happened to my dog was harmed or my dog was killed, I gave my dog to Dogtopia. So is Dogtopia responsible to make me whole for the loss to my dog? Or is the Doggy Hilton responsible? That's the kind of question being asked here. And Ulla says that Rabbi Elazar says in the case of a bailee who conveyed a deposit that was entrusted to him to another bailee, well, the first bailee is exempt for any occurrence for which he would have been exempt had he kept the deposit with him, right? A bailee doesn't have to make you whole for every kind of harm that comes to the animal you entrust with him, because if it was really beyond his control and it would have the harm would have happened to the animal no matter who was watching it, then he's exempt from that. So if the harm that ultimately befell my animal was the kind that he would have been exempt from paying me damages, even if it was in his care, then the fact that he transferred it to another bailee is not going to mean that I get those damages, because it was the kind of harm that my bailee would have been exempt from paying. So it doesn't matter that he transferred to another bailee. And it is not necessary to state that it is not necessary to state this in the case of an unpaid bailee who conveyed a deposit to a paid bailee, right? If I just ask Dogtopia, who happens to be my friend, to watch the dog, and they actually pay the Doggy Hilton to watch the dog, right? Now, the Doggy Hilton is a paid bailee. Now, paid bailee obviously has a higher degree of responsibility to watch the animal than somebody who's doing it for me as a favor, right? The unpaid bailee. So obviously, if the unpaid bailee transfers the animal that he was supposed to watch to a paid bailee, well, he's increasing the level of care that my animal is going to get. So of course, he's not going to become liable in a situation where he would have been exempt now that he transferred it to somebody who's going to safeguard it even better than he would have. So rather, this is the law. So it's not necessary to say that. And in fact, this law, they say this law even in a case of a paid bailee who conveyed the animal to an unpaid bailee, thereby decreasing the level of safekeeping. In this case, the first bailee is exempt for any occurrence for which he would have been exempt had he kept a deposit with him, because he conveyed it. And even though it was to an unpaid bailee, nevertheless, he conveyed it to a mentally competent person, and he thereby fulfilled his responsibility to ensure that the deposit is safeguarded. Rava said, with regard to a bailee who conveyed a deposit to another bailee, the first bailee becomes liable to pay for any loss to the item, even for mishaps for which he would not have been liable had he kept the deposit with him, because he didn't fulfill his mission. And the Gemara adds, and it is not necessary to state this case in the case of a paid bailee who conveyed a deposit to an unpaid bailee, thereby decreasing the level of safekeeping. But rather, this is the law even in the case of an unpaid bailee who conveyed a deposit to a paid bailee, thereby increasing the level of its safeguarding, that nonetheless he is liable, right? Because according to Rava, since he did, either I asked him or I paid him to watch my animal, I didn't foresee that he was going to transfer my animal to someone else. And when he did that, he becomes liable for any damage that comes to my animal. Even if it had been in his own care, he would have been exempt from liability. But that's the minority opinion, or at least the opinion according to Rava, not the opinion according to Ulla in the name of Rabbi Lazar. Now, according to Rava, the reason that he is liable is that the owner of the deposit can say to him, listen, you are credible to me with regard to taking an oath, but this other bailee to whom you conveyed my item, he is not credible to me with regard to taking an oath. Why does this matter? If an occurrence for which a bailee does not carry liability occurs, and it damages the deposited animal, in order to release himself from an obligation to pay, the bailee must take an oath to the item's owner that none of the types of occurrences for which he bears liability is what actually occurred. Rava rules that the owner is required to accept an oath only from the bailee with whom he entrusted his item, but not from anyone else. Accordingly, since the first bailee was not present when the event occurred, he is unable to attest to what happened. And even if the second bailee takes an oath to that effect, the owner is not obligated to accept that oath. Consequently, the first bailee bears full liability for any loss, according to Rava. Now, the Gemara cites another law taught by Ulla, right? We're just doing some halachas brought by Ulla. And also citing Rabbi Lazar. And Ulla says that Rabbi Lazar says the law is that one can collect from the debtor the slaves that he owns as payment for a debt. Right now we're talking about Canaanite slaves when slavery was practiced in the ancient world, as opposed to Hebrew slaves, because Hebrew slaves were indentured servants, right? They weren't like property that could be bought and sold from one master to another. But Canaanite slaves were. So if I lend someone money and he's not going to pay, and he doesn't pay me back, right? So I'm going to seize collateral. I'm going to seize the property that I had a lien on it. Now, if he doesn't pay me and he has money or movable property, I'm going to take that. If he only has real property, okay, I had a lien on his real property that ran with the loan. And as a creditor, I'm allowed to seize his intermediate level real property. What if he doesn't have real property? He doesn't have money, he doesn't have movable property, but he owns a slave. Can I take his slave? So Ulla seems to be saying in the name of Rabbi Lazar, yes. And we've seen elsewhere in the Talmud that Canaanite slaves were treated like real property in terms of, creditor, borrow creditor, creditor and borrower law, right? For the purposes of these kinds of laws, slaves were treated like real property. Now, Rav Nachman said to Ulla, whoa. Did Rabbi Elazar say that this law applies even when collecting from a debtor's orphans? Okay, he borrowed money from you. He doesn't pay back. You can seize his property, and if the only property available is a slave, you can seize that. But as we've discussed before, if the borrower dies, and he had land, and his sons inherited that land. So now the creditor can still come along, who has a lien on that land, and take the land, or as much of the land as he needs to satisfy the debt, even though normally a creditor cannot seize money or movable property from orphans, right? From the heirs of the original borrower. But with respect to real property, because there was a lien on the land, he can seize that even from orphans. So now that we're saying that Canaanite slaves were treated like real property, can this creditor seize a slave that the sons inherited from their father? Right, so Rav Steinsaltz explains, a creditor can collect the debt from orphans only by taking the land that the debtor bequeathed to his children. Rav Nachman asks whether this also extends to collecting any slaves that the children inherited, and Ulla replied, no. A creditor collects a debt by taking slaves only when he collects directly from the debtor himself. So Rav Nachman challenges this. But when the creditor collects from him, he can collect the debt even from the cloak that is upon his shoulders. And therefore, he can certainly also collect the debt by taking his slaves. So what is the novelty of this ruling? And Ulla explains, with what are we dealing here? We are dealing with a case where the debtor set aside his slave as designated repayment, apoteki. Consequently, if the slave was subsequently sold to a third party and the debtor was later unable to repay the debt, the creditor can seize the slave from the third party as payment of the debt. In other words, it's like he sold a piece of land that had a lien on it. Likewise, a slave can be designated collateral so that even if you sell him, the lien on that slave, that Canaanite slave, runs with him. Now, even though generally only land can be seized from a buyer as payment for the seller's debt, a slave is considered to have similar status to the land in this regard. And this is in accordance with the opinion of Rava. As Rava says, if a master set aside his slave as designated repayment of a debt and then sold him, the master's creditor collects the debt by taking the slave. But if one set aside his ox as designated repayment and then sold it, the creditor does not collect the debt by taking the ox. So what's the difference between the slave and the ox? What is the reason for this difference? And the Gemara explains the designation of this slave generates publicity, since a slave is significant and identifiable. Therefore, any prospective buyer is assumed to have done his due diligence and become aware of the status of the slave and accepted the consequences of purchasing him. But the designation of this ox as dedicated repayment does not generate publicity, since one ox is not easily distinguishable from another. And a buyer cannot be assumed to be aware that the ox was set aside as designated repayment. Therefore, it is unfair that one who purchases such an ox should have it seized from him. Therefore, the sages enacted that a creditor cannot do so. Now we're on page 12a. The Gemara relates, after Rav Nachman exited the study hall, Ulla said to the remaining sages in the study hall, in truth, this is what Rabbi Elazar said. A slave can be collected as payment even when collecting from the debtor's orphans. Generally, when collecting a debt from the debtor's orphans, the creditor can collect only from the land that they inherited from their father, which is liened to the debt. Rabbi Elazar rules that a creditor can also collect from the slaves they inherited. Why? Because he holds that in this regard, the legal status of slaves is like that of land. Ulla did not reveal this fact to Rav Nachman, as he knew that Rav Nachman disagreed and held that the legal status of slaves is like that of movable property. So when he heard of Ulla's revelation, Rav Nachman said, Ulla evaded me, as had he told me Rabbi Elazar's full opinion, I would have brought proofs against his opinion. I guess Ulla just didn't want to get into an argument that day. Now, the Gemara relates there was an incident in Nehardea, and the judges of Nehardea collected, on behalf of a creditor, slaves that orphans had inherited from the debtor. And there was an incident, so in other words, they did this, right? Per the ruling of Ulla in the name of Rabbi Elazar, so a creditor was able to collect slaves that had been inherited by the sons of a debtor. And there was another incident in Pumbedisa, and Rav Chana bar Bizna collected slaves from orphans as repayment for a debt. So it seems like they did it in both Pumbedisa and Nehardea. They followed the ruling of Ulla in the name of Rabbi Elazar. Rav Nachman said to those judges, right, because Rav Nachman doesn't think that slaves have the same legal status as land. He says that slaves have the same status as movable property, and therefore you can collect a debt from them using slaves. You can collect a debt from the original debtor, but not from his inheritors. Rav Nachman said to those judges who ruled not like Rav Nachman, but rather like Rabbi Elazar, he said to those judges, go and return those slaves to the orphans. And if you do not do so, we will collect the value of the slaves from the proceeds of your own mansions in order to compensate the orphans for their loss, as you have made an elementary mistake in your ruling, and therefore you are responsible to rectify it. So Rav Nachman was very confident in his opinion and didn't care that Ulla brought a different ruling in the name of Rabbi Elazar. So Rava said to Rav Nachman, hey, listen, there is Ulla, there is Rabbi Elazar, there are the judges of Nehardea, and there is Rav Chana bar Bizna, all of whom ruled based on the assumption that the legal status of slaves is like that of land. So listen, Rav Nachman, in accordance with whose opinion do you hold, right? He was much more polite. He said, in accordance with whose opinion does the master hold, meaning you. So Rav Nachman said to Rava, I know a baraisa that supports my opinion. As Avimi teaches, a document that prevents the sabbatical year from abrogating an outstanding debt. This is known as a prospul, right? Because all debts would be canceled in the sabbatical year. And that meant that lenders wouldn't lend to poor people as the sabbatical year was approaching because they knew the debt would be canceled. And that meant that poor people who needed loans couldn't get them. So the sages instituted a mechanism where you could borrow as the seventh year was approaching and the debt would not be canceled in the sabbatical year. How so? The lender and the borrower go to the court, and the court issues this prospul, and basically it means that the debtor doesn't owe the money directly to the lender. He's now going to owe it to the court, and the court is going to owe it to the lender. And debts to the court are not canceled by the sabbatical year. That's the prospul. So a document that prevents a sabbatical year from abrogating an outstanding debt, the prospul, takes effect upon a debt assumed by one who owns land. But a prospul does not take effect upon a debt assumed by one who owns slaves of the debtor. Right, so very interesting that you're not going to issue a prospul in every case because the court doesn't want to get stuck with a bad loan. So they're only going to do it in a situation where the borrower has, some land, right? Where the borrower has land. And now what they're saying is, if he has land, yes, we'll issue the prospul. If he has slaves, no, we won't. So that would seem to argue that slaves, Canaanite slaves, were not treated, did not have the legal status of real property, of land. And movable property is acquired together with the land that one acquires through an active acquisition, a kinyan performed on the land. Right. So if you're buying, land and all the movable property that's on it, okay. So when you make a kinyan on the land, the movable property comes with it. You don't have to also do a separate kinyan, formal active acquisition, on all the movable property that's located on that land. But movable property cannot be acquired together with the slaves that one acquires. So both laws assume that in these cases, the legal status of slaves is not like that of land. And the Gemara suggests, let us say that this issue is the subject of a dispute between Tanaim, rabbis of the Mishna, in the following baraisas. One baraisa teaches, if one sold slaves and land to a buyer, and the buyer took possession of the slaves alone, he does not thereby acquire the land. If he took possession of the land alone, he does not thereby acquire the slaves. If one sold land, because if you sold multiple fields, he doesn't have to do an active acquisition on each field. He can do an active acquisition on one field, and all the fields are then considered acquired if you were making a deal for multiple fields. But if you're making a deal to sell somebody a field and a slave, he has to do separate acts of acquisition. So again, it sounds like slaves do not have the legal status of land. If one sold land and movable property to a buyer and the buyer took possession of the land alone, he thereby also acquires the movable property. If he took possession of the movable property alone, he does not thereby acquire the land. If one sold slaves and movable property to a buyer and the buyer took possession of the slaves alone, he does not thereby acquire the movable property. If he took possession of the movable property alone, he does not thereby acquire the slaves. Sounds like land, slaves, movable property, three separate categories. And we don't treat the slaves and the land like the same category, according to that baraisa. But isn't it taught in another baraisa, if the buyer took possession of the slaves alone, he thereby does acquire the movable property? And this directly contradicts the ruling in the parallel clause of the previous baraisa. And what? Is it not the case that it is about this that they disagree? That one sage, the Tan of the second baraisa, holds that the legal status of slaves is like that of land, and the other sage, the Tan of the first baraisa, holds that the legal status of slaves is like that of movable property rather than like land. And the Gemara rejects this analysis. Rav Ika, the son of Rav Ami, said, according to everyone, the legal status of slaves is generally like that of land, and therefore, that which is taught in the second baraisa, that by taking possession of the slaves, he also acquires the movable property, is properly understood. You can acquire movable property by acquiring land, so if you can also acquire movable property by acquiring a slave, that shows that a slave and land have the same legal status. And that which is taught in the first baraisa, that in such a case he does not acquire the movable property, the reason for this ruling is that the Tan of that baraisa holds that in order for movable property to be acquired together with land, we require that he acquire land which is similar to the fortified cities in Judea. This is based on a verse, 2 Chronicles 21:3, which do not move around. Slaves, even if their legal status is generally like that of land, do not fulfill this requirement. Their legal status might be like land, but because they move around, their legal status is not like land in every legal circumstance. Now, the reason behind the need for land to be like the fortified cities in Judea is that the law that one can acquire movable property together with land is derived from this verse. As we learned in a Mishna, in Tractate Kedushin, our last tractate, page 26a, property that does not serve as a guarantee, meaning movable property as opposed to land, is acquired together with property that does serve as a guarantee, i.e. land, be it through the buyer giving money to the seller, or by the seller giving the buyer a bill of sale, or by the buyer performing an act of taking possession of the land. And the Gemara asks, from where is this matter derived? And Chizkiah said, as the verse states, and their father gave them great gifts of silver and of gold and of precious things with fortified cities in Judea. And the verse indicates that the acquisition of the movable property was done together with that of the cities of Judea. Who is bequeathing cities? A king can bequeath a city. Now we're going to skip a few paragraphs where there's a discussion of movable property and slaves and how acquires one or the other, that we actually covered this before in Tractate Kedushin and also in Tractate Gittin. So we're moving down to page 12b. Let's get back to the law of damages. Our Mishnah, Mishnah number 2 here in chapter 1, taught one is liable for damage that he causes to another person's property. One is liable only with regard to damage caused to property. In this case, we're talking about consecrated property. Caused to property for which, were he to use it for a non-sacred purpose, he would not be liable for the misuse of consecrated property. This is known as me'ilah. right? So if something became consecrated, okay, that means basically the Holy Temple owns it, and it's now going to be used, for the spiritual needs of the nation. It no longer belongs to an individual. If you make personal use of consecrated property and you do it unwittingly, so then you have committed the sin, the transgression of me'ilah, you're going to have to replace, give back whatever you used, plus a fine of 20%, and bring a guilt offering because you committed me'ilah. So when would you have a case where there's consecrated property and you make personal use of it, but you have not committed the transgression of me'ilah? And that's going to involve a case where there's offerings of lesser sanctity that might be designated as an offering, but before they've been brought, like this is like a peace offering as opposed to an elevation offering. It's not an optional offering. You don't have to bring it. And until you've actually brought it to the temple and handed it over to the priest, it's still considered your property. So if you make use of it while, you've chosen it to become a peace offering, but it's not that you've designated it to be a sin offering or an elevation offering, which are offerings of higher sanctity. Those, if you made personal use of them, even before they were sacrificed, you would have committed me'ilah. Offerings of lesser sanctity, you have not. Okay, so regarding this, the Gemara infers the property in question does not have the prohibition of me'ilah, but it is consecrated property, and yet one is liable for causing damage to it. And the Gemara asks, who is the Tana that holds like this? And the Gemara answers, Rabbi Yochanan said, the Mishna is referring to offerings of lesser sanctity, and it is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yosei HaGalili, who says that such offerings, before they are slaughtered, are considered property of their owners as opposed to property of heaven. It is only once such an offering is slaughtered that it becomes subject to the laws of me'ilah. So as it is taught in a baraisa that concerning one who steals another person's property and he takes a false oath denying that he stole it, then he incurs an obligation to bring a guilt offering. So about him, the verse states, quote, and commits a trespass against the Lord and deals falsely with his neighbor. Leviticus 5:21. So that verse serves to include a case in which one denies having in his possession offerings of lesser sanctity, which are the property of their owners. This is the statement of Rabbi Yosei HaGalili. So somebody's going on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. When the temple is standing, they're going to bring a peace offering, right? That's a voluntary offering, not an obligatory offering. That's why it's lesser sanctity. He's designated the animal for that. Then somebody steals that animal. So this is not considered me'ilah because it's still the property of the one who's going to bring it up to Jerusalem. Then when he denies, when he takes a false oath about what he stole, he's committed an additional crime. He's going to have to make up for that too when he, comes to his senses and decides to atone, both for the theft and for the false oath. So as it is taught, commits a trespass against the Lord. And this verse serves to include a case in which one did. Right. So the Gemara asks, but didn't we learn in the Mishna, Tractate Kedushin 52b, in the case of a priest who betroths a woman with his portion of an offering? Now we're talking about offerings of the highest sanctity, a sin offering, right? When a sin offering is brought to atone for somebody's unwitting sin, when the temple is standing, some of it goes up on the altar, and some of it is given to the priests to eat, right? That's a very holy thing when the priests eat their portion of a sin offering. But when a priest is given his portion of a sin offering, is it just part of the ritual that he eats some of the sin offering in order to, complete the atonement process of the one who brought the sin offering? Or does the priest who receives this edible portion that only priests can eat, when he receives that, is it like his property that he could then use to betroth a woman because it's his property, right? When you betroth someone, you have to use your own property for the betrothal. So can a priest who's been given a piece of a sin offering to eat, can he use that piece of meat as the item of value with which to betroth a woman? I mean, Sounds pretty far-fetched. She can't eat it, right? Only a priest can eat it. But perhaps he could give it to a fellow priest who's the father of an underage daughter who could accept it for the girl's betrothal. Would that work? But didn't we learn in that Mishnah that a priest who betroths a woman with his portion of an offering, whether it is from offerings of the most sacred order, like the sin offering, or from offerings of lesser sanctity, like a peace offering, that she is not betrothed. It's not his to give. She is not betrothed. And shall we say that the Mishnah is not in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yosei HaGalili? And the Gemara suggests you can even say that it is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yosei HaGalili, as when Rabbi Yosei HaGalili said that offerings of lesser sanctity are the property of their owners, that applies only when the animal is still alive. But after its slaughter, even Rabbi Yosei HaGalili concedes that the offering takes on a higher degree of sanctity, and it is now the property of heaven, and if somebody makes personal use of it, they would have committed me'ilah. As when the priests receive their portions, they do not receive them because those portions belong to them. Rather, they receive them because they are guests at the table of the Most High. They're eating by the largesse of the Holy One, blessed be He. Now the Gemara asks, but does he say his opinion only when the offering is still alive? But didn't we learn in a Mishnah, Meiser Sheni, with regard to the male firstborn of a kosher animal, which is endowed upon its birth with the sanctity of an offering of lesser sanctity, the Bechor, a priest may sell it if it is unblemished and alive, but he may not sell it once it is slaughtered, as if an unblemished firstborn animal is slaughtered, it is prohibited to derive benefit from it. And if it is blemished, one can sell it, both when it is alive or after it is slaughtered. And one can betroth a woman with it. This Mishnah assumes that even when a firstborn animal is unblemished, it is considered to be the property of the priest. And Rav Nachman says that Rabba bar Abu says they taught this only with regard to the status of a firstborn animal in the present, since it is not fit to be sacrificed, as there is no temple. The priests have ownership of it. But when the temple is standing, in which case the animal is fit to be sacrificed, then no. When the temple is standing, a priest may slaughter and eat the firstborn only if it becomes blemished. Nowadays, since it is not possible to offer it as a sacrifice, it is certain that the animal will eventually develop a blemish and the priest will then be permitted to slaughter and eat it. Consequently, the priest is considered to have ownership of the firstborn even before it develops any blemish because there's not a temple to slaughter it in. And Rava raised an objection to Rav Nachman from the Baraisa cited above. The verse states, a person who sins and commits a trespass against the Lord. And the verse serves to include a case in which one denies having in his possession offerings of lesser sanctity, as they are the property of their owners. This is the statement of Rabbi Yosei. Rabbi Yosei is clearly referring to a time when the temple is standing, as it is based on a verse that continues to obligate one to bring a guilt offering. Nevertheless, he states that the offerings of lesser sanctity, of which a firstborn is one example, they are considered to be the property of their owners even when they are unblemished. And Ravina answered that Rabbi Yosei said with regard to a firstborn outside of the land of Israel, and is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Shimon, who says if firstborn animals came from outside the land of Israel to the land of Israel, and they're unblemished, they may be sacrificed on the altar. From Rabbi Shimon's formulation, it is apparent that if they came, then yes, they're sacrificed, but they should not be brought ab initio. Since the firstborn animals should not be brought to the land of Israel, they are considered unfit to be sacrificed, and therefore they are considered to be the property of the priest even before they develop a blemish. It is apparent, I'm almost done, questions or comments, please get them in. It is apparent that Ravina understood Rav Nachman's qualification to be true even according to Rabbi Yosei HaGalili. Therefore, the Gemara asks, and if it is so, that when Rabbi Yosei HaGalili said that an offering of lesser sanctity is the property of the owner, that was referring only to a situation when they are still alive. So according to that view, let Ravina answer Rava's objection by saying, this Baraisa, which states that an offering of lesser sanctity is the property of its owner and may be sold even when the temple stands, this is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yosei HaGalili, and it is referring to a case where the animal is still alive. And that qualification of the Mishnah by Rav Nachman, that the sale of an unblemished firstborn animal when the temple is standing, this sale is invalid, it is in accordance with the opinion of the rabbis who dispute Rabbi Yossei's opinion. And the Gemara answers, he said to him that this is not difficult. Do you speak of gifts to which members of the priesthood are entitled, of which firstborn animal is an example? Gifts of the priesthood are different from other offerings of lesser sanctity, as when the priests receive their portions, they receive them from the table of the Most High. Rabbi Yossei HaGalili claims that the act of consecration of an animal as an offering of lesser sanctity does not nullify one's ownership of the animal. The sanctity of a firstborn offering takes effect with its birth, so it may be that it was never owned. Rather, it is reasonable that the Torah provided the priest only with the right and obligation to partake of it after it was sacrificed. And this is all pertaining to that clause in our Mishnah about one who is partially responsible for the damage, that he nevertheless owes all of the damage. But we only say this if the damaged animal was consecrated, that it would be a case where if he made use of that animal, he would not be committing me'ilah, that he owes the damage because he owes the damage to a person, right, who still has ownership of the animal, even though it's consecrated. Once it becomes me'ilah, that it's already in the domain of the temple, if you damage that, there's going to be a different set of consequences. We're not addressing that right now. Okay, let's take a couple of questions. On Bava, Kamma 11 and 12. Lucy, Mary is supposed to take care of my dog, but she brought him to the Hilton daycare. My dog was bitten and injured at the Hilton. So I understand Mary is liable to me for the damage. Yes. And the Hilton is liable to Mary now, I would think, but the law does not allow for the Hilton to compensate me, bypassing Mary altogether. Yes, that's what it sounds like, right? Your action is against Mary. Now, the interesting question would be, Mary split. She gave the dog to the Hilton, and then the Hilton was negligent. Now, they were negligent in their obligation to Mary, but Mary's not around. So the question is, can you bring an action against the Hilton in that situation? I'm not sure what the answer is. So you've correctly identified a difficult case. Jonathan, I am interested in the conflict of Ulla and Rav Nachman. It seems that there was enough friction between them that Ulla does not talk with frankness in front of him. It still gets back to Rav Nachman, so I'm not sure why Ulla would do this and why the Talmud would record it this way to highlight this is not good behavior. I mean, that is such a good question, Jonathan. There is no question that the sages are tzaddikim, right? They're righteous individuals, and everything that they do is Torah. Not just the statements from their mouths, but their very actions are Torah that we can learn from. And yet, sometimes they're very, very harsh with each other. And you can see just the kind of resentments and, politics can erupt even among them. And then we say, how could this be recorded in the Talmud? It doesn't make them look good. The answer is, I think, similar to the question that I asked, before I became religious, and I took a class in college, the Bible is literature, and I encountered the story of Dinah being raped by the prince of Shechem, right? And then, but he falls in love with her and wants to marry her, and his father comes out and says, okay, Jacob and all your people, you can settle here and we can intermarry and become one people. And Jacob's sons say, yeah, okay. They agree, but then they say, but if you want to intermarry with us, you have to get circumcised. The men all circumcised themselves. The prince was really desiring to marry Dinah and was a great salesman to all the people. And they all circumcised themselves. And then Levi and Shimon go in at night and kill all the men. And they take all the women and children as slaves. And they leave a ghost town. And I never heard that story in Hebrew school when I was a kid studying for my bar mitzvah. And I had no rabbi to discuss it with in my life for several years. And, then I find a rabbi at a wedding. And I asked him, that story, how does that make the Jews look good? And that rabbi, I got to say, was a crummy rabbi. And he gave me no answer at all. He just dodged the question and headed for the dessert buffet. But later rabbis in my life who were excellent rabbis said, yeah, that story doesn't make the Jews look good. Not every story in the Bible makes the Jews look good by any means. And in fact, Jacob didn't think that story made, his tribe look good. And he was furious with his sons Levi and Shimon, and he reminded them of it on his deathbed. And so the Torah and some of the stories here included in the Talmud, we don't always learn from positive examples. Sometimes it's our job to learn from negative examples. Now, I'm not sure that this necessarily is a negative example. Maybe what Ulla was doing was avoiding a conflict that was going to be an emotional conflict rather than a conflict for the sake of Torah. And that's why he handled it the way that he did. I mean, Ulla is known to be kind of a difficult character from time to time. So I certainly don't judge him, and I'm not sure what all the circumstances were there. But I think that general principle stands that sometimes, behavior is recorded for us to learn from, not as a positive example, but as a negative example, sometimes. That's what I've got for us tonight, and with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Thursday, at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific. Have a great night.